The rain pounded against the dusty windows of Willow Creek Orphanage, turning the glass into a curtain of aimless droplets, much like Luke's thoughts. He was sitting on the cold floor of the room, leaning against the peeling wall, scribbling something pointless on a crumpled piece of paper. Across the room, Ethan made noises with his mouth as he pushed a plastic toy truck, its front wheel broken for months. "Luke!" Ethan called, his voice still carrying that childish tone, now mixed with a sadness that seemed too big for a 10-year-old boy. Luke looked up slowly, already anticipating the question that was coming. He knew that look, the distant expression Ethan always had before bringing up something difficult. "Do you think she still thinks about us?" Ethan asked, stopping his play. Luke closed his eyes for a moment, trying to suppress the mix of pain and frustration that those words brought. He hated the idea that Ethan still clung to that sliver of hope, but he didn't have the heart to completely crush his brother's dreams. "I don't know, Ethan. Maybe," he replied carefully, not wanting to feed false expectations. Because I think about her every day." Ethan lowered his head, nervously fiddling with the truck. "I keep wondering if she's okay or if she's, Luke moved closer and crouched down beside his brother. He placed his hand on Ethan's small, thin shoulder, a gesture he had learned to use when words weren't enough. "Listen, Ethan, we don't know where she is or how she's doing, but I know she did everything she could for us, and I'm here, okay? You'll always have me, but she said she'd come back." Ethan's voice came out as a whisper, almost inaudible. Luke felt a tightness in his chest. He remembered his mother's last promise, made the day she was taken by the agents. "I'll come back for you, I promise," she had said as she was pushed into the car, her eyes red from crying. That scene was etched in his memory like a movie that replayed every time he closed his eyes. "She said that, Ethan, but sometimes things don't go the way we want them to." Luke struggled to keep his voice steady, even as he felt his throat tighten. Ethan looked at his brother, his eyes full of questions he didn't know how to ask. After a moment of silence, he went back to pushing the toy truck, but the noise no longer had the same enthusiasm as before. The orphanage's dining hall was a simple place, with gray walls and wooden tables etched with the names of children who had passed through. The soup served that night was thin and tasteless, but it was hot, and that was enough. Luke and Ethan sat in their usual corner, away from the other children. It was a habit of theirs, something Luke insisted on to protect Ethan from comments or teasing. "Mr. Collins said there's going to be an event on Saturday." Ethan broke the silence, looking at the bowl in front of him as he stirred the soup with his spoon. "Oh yeah? What kind of event?" Luke asked, not because he was genuinely interested, but because he knew Ethan needed to talk about anything other than their mom. "He said there's going to be a party at the church, with cake and everything." Ethan's tone carried a hint of excitement, but it quickly faded. "But I don't know if they'll let us go." Luke nodded slowly, thinking about how events like that rarely included kids like them. It was as if the world forgot they existed. "If they don't let us go, we'll have our own party here," Luke said, trying to get a smile from Ethan. "With what?" "The soup." Ethan tried to joke, but his laugh came out weak. Luke shrugged, forcing a smile. "Sure, we'll grab 2 spoons and have a soup fight. How about that?" Ethan laughed, this time genuinely, and Luke felt a small sense of relief. It was in moments like these that he saw his younger brother as a real kid, not a boy carrying more sadness than he should at his age. Later that night, back in their room, Luke lay on his bed, staring at the ceiling with his hands clasped behind his head. He listened to Ethan's calm breathing, who had fallen asleep after insisting on holding his brother's hand until he drifted off. The sound of the rain outside was a constant reminder of the loneliness he felt, but also an echo of his determination. He thought again of his mother, her tired eyes and the smile she always forced, even when she knew dinner that night would be just bread and water. And then there was his father, the man he could barely picture, but who occupied a silent space in his mind. "Who were you?" Luke whispered into the empty air, as if he could get an answer. He had never asked much about his father, because he knew it would only bring more pain to his mother. But now, with her gone and the responsibility for Ethan weighing on his shoulders, he couldn't avoid the curiosity. Why had he left them? Did he know what happened afterward? Before finally falling asleep, Luke turned on his side and looked at Ethan, who was sleeping peacefully. "I'll take care of you, buddy. Always," he promised in a low voice. Looking out the window, the rain seemed to have slowed down, but inside Luke, the storms continued. The morning sun lit up Willow Creek Orphanage, but the worn walls and old furniture seemed to absorb any hint of warmth or joy. It was an ordinary Saturday, with no classes or planned activities, and the place had that quietness only interrupted by the sound of children playing in the yard. Luke was alone in the room he shared with Ethan, organizing a pile of clothes and belongings he had accumulated over the years. "What are you doing?" Ethan asked, coming into the room with flushed cheeks after running around outside. Trying to tidy this up, Luke pointed to the corner of the room, where a pile of disorganized boxes and bags leaned against the wall. "It's getting hard to even find my socks." Ethan rolled his eyes but threw himself onto the bed to watch his older brother. "You sound like Mrs. Holloway now. Organization is the key to a peaceful life," Ethan mimicked in an exaggerated voice, making Luke laugh for the first time that morning. "Well, whether she's right or not, this place is a mess," Luke replied, tossing an old cap at Ethan, who dodged it skillfully. In the middle of tidying up, Luke pulled out a dusty box that seemed long forgotten. It was smaller than the others and was covered with a faded cloth. He frowned as he placed it on the floor, wiping away the dust with his hand. "What's that?" Ethan asked, sitting up on the bed, now curious. "I don't know. I don't think I've ever seen this before." When Luke opened the box, the smell of mold and old paper filled the air. He carefully removed a cloth that seemed to be part of an old dress. Underneath it, there was a worn leather suitcase with frayed edges and a slightly rusty clasp. "It's our mom's," Ethan said, recognizing the suitcase immediately. "Remember? She had it the last time we saw her." Luke paused for a moment, the memory hitting him like a punch. He remembered her clutching that suitcase tightly against her chest while she spoke with the social workers, pleading for them not to separate the two brothers. "How did it end up here?" Luke murmured to himself, but Ethan heard him. "I think they brought it with us." Luke was silent for a moment, trying to process the mix of emotions that seeing that suitcase brought. He looked at Ethan, who was staring at the object as if it held all the answers to unasked questions. "There's only one way to find out," Luke said, picking up the suitcase and placing it on the bed. He opened the clasp carefully, as if he were handling something sacred. Inside, there were only a few things: a folded floral scarf, a faded photograph of when they were little, and some yellowed sheets of paper. Ethan took the photo carefully while Luke examined the rest. "Look, Luke, it's us," Ethan said excitedly, holding the picture up for his brother to see. The image showed the two boys sitting on their mother's lap, who wore a simple dress but had a smile that lit up her face. It was a picture full of life, taken in happier days, before everything fell apart. "Yeah, that's us," Luke replied, but his attention shifted when he picked up the yellowed sheets that were carefully folded. As he unfolded them, he realized they weren't just ordinary sheets. They were sheet music, scribbled with musical notes and annotations in the margins. "What's this?" Ethan asked, peering over his brother's shoulder. "It looks like music." Luke's eyes scanned the lines of notes and handwritten segments. Some words were smudged, but he could make out things like "for grace" and "our moment together." A chill ran down his spine. "Do you think this was Mom's?" Ethan asked. "I don't think so. Look here." Luke pointed to a name sign at the corner of the last sheet. "It's signed Michael. That must be our dad." Ethan was silent, absorbing this new information. They had never had anything tangible related to their father, only vague stories and blurry memories. "Do you think he was a musician?" Ethan asked, his childish curiosity beginning to shine through. Luke shrugged, still processing what he was holding. I don't know, but if he wrote this, maybe he wanted someone to play it. The silence between the brothers was interrupted when Ethan pointed to the corner of the room. The old guitar. Luke looked in the direction Ethan pointed and saw the instrument leaning against the wall. Another forgotten item among the orphanage's donations. He had never paid much attention to the guitar, but now it seemed impossible to ignore. I don't know how to play, Luke said, but still picked up the guitar and set it on his lap. You can learn, Ethan encouraged, excited by the idea. Luke held the guitar carefully, adjusting the dusty and slightly loose strings. He looked again at the sheet music and tried to strum a few notes. The sound came out off-key, but it wasn't enough to discourage him. I think I'll give it a try. Ethan smiled, seeing a new spark in Luke's eyes. It's like having a piece of Dad, even if we don't know him. Luke didn't reply, but Ethan's words echoed within him. That sheet music was more than just music. It was a connection to a past they had never fully understood. Over the following weeks, Luke spent every free moment trying to decipher the music. He adjusted the guitar strings, tested the chords, and tried to figure out what his father was trying to say with those notes. With each bit of progress, he felt like he was getting a little closer to understanding who Michael was. The man who left them behind, but somehow also left a piece of himself for them to find. Mornings at Willow Creek Orphanage always began with the sound of doors opening, children laughing or arguing, and Mrs. Holloway shouting instructions down the hallway. But in recent weeks, there was a new sound in the air, Luke's clumsy but persistent attempts at playing the old guitar in the room. Luke, you're going to wake everyone up, Ethan complained, covering his head with a pillow but unable to hide a smile. It's better to wake up with music than with Mrs. Holloway, don't you think? Luke shot back, continuing to strum a melody that was beginning to make some sense. Mornings had changed for Luke. Since he found his father's sheet music, he couldn't think of anything else but learning to play it and bring the unfinished song to life. Every note seemed loaded with meanings he didn't fully understand yet, but they motivated him to keep going. In the dining hall, as the children had breakfast, the sound of Luke's guitar playing had become a topic among the caretakers. He's talented, you know, Mrs. Holloway said to Mr. Collins as they served pancakes to the children. Talent or stubbornness? Mr. Collins responded with a half-smile. Maybe both. But I've seen a lot of kids come through here. He's different. I can't explain it, but the way he throws himself into it. It's like music is all he has. Their conversation didn't go unnoticed. Luke, who was sitting at a nearby table with Ethan, pretended not to hear, but he felt his cheeks grow warm. He focused on eating, but Mrs. Holloway's words kept echoing in his mind. Later that same day, while Luke was playing alone in his room, Mrs. Holloway appeared at the door, holding an application form. Luke! He stopped playing and looked at her, wary. Yes, ma'am. She walked into the room and sat on the edge of Ethan's empty bed. Did you know we have a community music project in town? She began, holding the paper as if it were a prize. Luke shook his head. No. What's that? It's a program where young people can learn more about music, play in groups, perform, things like that. I talked to Mr. Collins, and we thought it might be a good idea to sign you up. Luke looked at her, surprised. Me? Yes, you. Mrs. Holloway laughed, as if the question was absurd. You have talent, Luke. Maybe you don't realize it, but it's something rare. And, well, it seems like music is important to you right now. Luke was silent, gripping the guitar a little tighter. The idea of doing something outside the orphanage made him nervous, but also excited. Does it cost money? He asked hesitantly. No. The project is sponsored by the local church and some businesses in town. They even have better instruments than that guitar. She smiled, pointing at the old instrument he was holding. Ethan, who had been listening at the door, entered the room with a big grin. Go for it, Luke. You could be a real musician. Luke shrugged, trying to look indifferent, but the truth was, he wanted it. He wanted it a lot. Okay, I'll try. The following week, Luke had his first lesson at the community music project. The space was modest, located in the basement of a church, but it was full of instruments, sheet music, and young people like him, all with one thing in common: a love for music. That's where he met Mr. Johnson, the teacher in charge of the project, a tall man with gray hair and warm eyes who seemed to see more than what met the eye. "You're Luke, right?" Mr. Johnson asked, shaking his hand firmly. "Yes, sir. Well, I heard you've got some talent." He smiled, looking at the guitar Luke had brought. "Let's see what you've got." Luke swallowed hard, nervous. He sat in a wooden chair and tried to play the melody he had been practicing for weeks. The notes weren't perfect yet, but there was something in them, a sincerity that caught the teacher's attention. When he finished, Mr. Johnson was silent for a few seconds before speaking. "Luke, you play like someone who has a lot to say but is still learning how to speak." He paused, watching the boy. "You know, music isn't just about technique. It's about emotion. It's about expressing what words can't." Luke nodded but still looked nervous. "Do you really want to learn?" Mr. Johnson asked. "I do, sir." "Great. Then let's start from the beginning." And so began Luke's journey. Each lesson was an opportunity to learn something new, to dive deeper into what music could offer. Mr. Johnson wasn't just a teacher. He was a mentor, someone who saw in Luke a raw talent that could be shaped. "That sheet music you found," Mr. Johnson said during one of the lessons, after hearing Luke talk about the unfinished song. "It seems like it means something special to you." "It's my dad's," Luke replied, his eyes fixed on the paper. "Then let's finish it together," Mr. Johnson said with an encouraging smile. From that moment, the sheet music became Luke's main focus. He spent hours practicing, exploring each note, each pause, trying to understand what his father was trying to say with that music. And as the weeks went by, something began to change. Luke realized that music wasn't just an escape, but a way to express everything he felt. The longing for his mother, the curiosity about his father, and the responsibility of taking care of Ethan. He played for Ethan at night while his brother closed his eyes and let the melody take him away from the orphanage, even if just for a few minutes. "You're going to be famous, Luke," Ethan said one night, smiling sleepily. Luke laughed but knew it wasn't about fame. It was about finding answers. Days at Willow Creek Orphanage had turned dark. Ethan, usually full of energy, lay in bed, his face pale and feverish. Luke sat beside his brother, holding his hand tightly. "It's okay, Ethan. It's just a cold," Luke said, trying to sound confident, but his voice trembled. Ethan tried to smile, but his face was tight with fever. "It's not just that, Luke. I know it's not." Luke swallowed hard. He knew his brother was right. For days, Ethan could barely eat or get up. The volunteer doctor who occasionally visited the orphanage had diagnosed an infection that required expensive medication for immediate treatment. But the orphanage, always overburdened and underfunded, couldn't afford the costs. That night, after Ethan had fallen asleep, Luke went to the kitchen where Mrs. Holloway was making tea. "How is he?" she asked without looking up from the kettle. "He's not getting better," Luke replied, his voice nearly breaking. "He needs that medicine, Mrs. Holloway. Isn't there another way?" She sighed, sitting at the table with Luke. "Luke, we've tried everything. We have to wait for some donation to come in, but that could take weeks." "Weeks?" Luke raised his voice, outraged. "He can't wait weeks. He needs it now." Mrs. Holloway lowered her head, unable to meet the boy's eyes. "I'm so sorry." Luke left the kitchen, his heart heavy and his mind racing. He went into the room where Ethan was sleeping and looked at the guitar leaning against the wall. His mind raced, searching for a solution. "I'm going to do something, Ethan. I promise," he whispered, determined. The next morning, Luke took his idea to Mr. Johnson, who was organizing instruments at the community project. "You want to play in restaurants and bars?" Mr. Johnson looked at him in surprise. "That's it, sir. I don't know what else to do. He needs the medicine, and I'm good at this." It's all I have. Mr. Johnson crossed his arms, thoughtful. Luke, you understand that this isn't that simple, right? It's not just picking up a guitar and playing. You need permission from the orphanage, someone to accompany you. I know. Luke took a deep breath. But I've thought of everything. I just need you, sir. Please. Mr. Johnson was silent for a moment, but the determination in Luke's eyes convinced him. All right, let's talk to Mrs. Holloway. Convincing Mrs. Holloway was another battle. No way, she exclaimed, looking from Luke to Mr. Johnson. A 13-year-old boy playing in bars? That's irresponsible. He won't be alone, Mr. Johnson interrupted. I'll be with him at all times. Luke stepped closer, looking directly at Mrs. Holloway with tears in his eyes. I have no other choice. Ethan has no other choice. Please let me try. She looked at the boy, her heart torn between the instinct to protect him and the desperate reality of the situation. This is temporary, right? She asked Mr. Johnson. Just until we raise enough money for the medicine, he replied. After a long sigh, Mrs. Holloway nodded. All right, but I want detailed reports of where you're going and who you're with. And Luke, if anything happens, nothing will happen. I promise. That night, Luke had his first performance at a small local restaurant. The place was simple, with a few tables and warm lights that created a cozy atmosphere. He was nervous, his hands trembling as he tuned the guitar, but Mr. Johnson was by his side. Breathe, Luke. Just think about what this means for you and Ethan. Luke nodded, stepped onto the small makeshift stage, and looked at the few people who were having dinner. He wasn't sure if he was ready, but he had no choice. Good evening. My name is Luke, and I'm going to play a few songs tonight. He started with something simple, a melody he had learned in the community project. The notes echoed through the restaurant, and the nervousness slowly faded as people's faces relaxed. At the end of the first song, some timid clapping began, and Luke felt more confident. When he started the second song, something changed. He played with his heart, letting each note carry a piece of his pain and hope. The silence in the restaurant was absolute, and when he finished, the applause was louder and warmer. After his performance, Luke collected donations in a small hat Mr. Johnson had brought. It wasn't much, but it was a start. That was amazing, Luke. You were amazing, said Mr. Johnson, placing his hand on Luke's shoulder as they left the restaurant. Luke just nodded, feeling exhausted but determined. In the weeks that followed, Luke played in different places. Each performance was a battle against fatigue and pressure, but also a step toward what he needed to help Ethan. How did it go tonight? Mrs. Holloway asked as Luke and Mr. Johnson returned late from a performance. We raised another $50, Luke replied, his face lit up by a tired smile. She nodded, visibly moved. You're doing something incredible, Luke. And when they finally raised enough, Luke went to the orphanage's doctor with the money in his hands. Here, please buy the medicine for my brother. The doctor looked at him, impressed by the boy's determination. You're a good brother, Luke. Ethan is lucky to have you. Luke just smiled, feeling a wave of relief and pride. He knew it wouldn't solve all their problems. But that night, when he saw Ethan sleeping more peacefully, he felt like he had won the first of many battles. The restaurant was a small refuge on a cold winter's night, with soft yellow lights and the scent of fresh coffee mingled with warm dishes. Luke was sitting in the corner of the room, tuning his guitar while Mr. Johnson reviewed the list of songs he would play that night. Today feels like a good day to take a chance, Luke, Mr. Johnson said, looking at the young musician with an encouraging smile. Luke stopped adjusting the strings and looked up, confused. What do you mean? The teacher picked up the sheet music they had both been working on for weeks. Your father's song. I think it's time to play it. Luke swallowed hard, feeling his hands sweat instantly. I don't know, sir. What if I mess up? Or if no one likes it? Mr. Johnson placed a hand on his shoulder, squeezing gently. Luke, this song is more than just notes on paper. It's your story. No one here can judge that. Just play, Luke took a deep breath and nodded. The idea of playing his father's unfinished song was terrifying, but he knew he was ready. When it was time to step onto the small makeshift stage, Luke felt his heart pounding faster than ever. He sat on the wooden stool, adjusted the microphone, and looked at the audience. The restaurant was full, but the conversations between tables quieted as he began to play. The first notes were familiar, calm, and full of emotion. He had memorized every detail of the sheet music, but the changes he and Mr. Johnson had made brought something new to life. Something that felt like it belonged to both him and his father. The music filled the room, and Luke closed his eyes as he played, letting the notes flow. The melody was delicate but carried a quiet strength. As if each chord told a part of a story he was only beginning to understand. When the last note sounded, the silence in the restaurant was almost absolute. For a moment, Luke thought no one had liked it, but then the sound of clapping started, slow and growing, until it filled the room. "Bravo!" Someone shouted, and Luke smiled, bowing his head shyly as Mr. Johnson clapped in the background, his pride evident. Luke was about to step off the stage when a woman approached. She looked to be in her early 40s, wearing a thick wool coat and holding a purse with both hands. Her face was marked by emotion, and her eyes shone with restrained tears. "That song!" she began, her voice trembling. "Where did you get that song?" Luke was surprised by the question, but answered, "It was a piece of sheet music I found from my father. He never finished it." The woman put her hand over her mouth, as if trying to contain an avalanche of emotions. "Your father," she repeated, still processing. "His name is Michael?" Luke nodded, cautious. "Yes. Did you know him?" The woman took a deep breath and smiled, though her eyes were still filled with tears. "Yes, I knew him. My name is Emily. I was a friend of his. More than that, I helped him compose." Luke was stunned for a moment, staring at Emily as if she were a piece of the puzzle he didn't even know he was looking for. "You helped him?" "Yes. That song." Emily paused, looking at the guitar. "He was composing it for your mother. It was his way of expressing how much he loved her." Mr. Johnson, who had moved closer, intervened gently. "Emily, you said you knew Michael. What happened to him?" She sighed, clearly struggling to organize her thoughts. "Michael was a talented man, but he carried many burdens. After Luke was born and later Ethan, he started to feel trapped, overwhelmed. He had big dreams, but the responsibility of supporting a family consumed him." Luke felt his stomach churn. Part of him wanted to hear more, but another part wanted to run from that conversation. "Why did he leave?" Luke asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. Emily looked at him with sadness. He felt like he wasn't good enough, that he couldn't be the father or husband you needed. "So he left. He thought your mother would be stronger without him." The silence that followed felt overwhelming. Luke didn't know how to process those words. On one hand, there was the pain of knowing his father chose to leave. On the other, there was the music, the proof that somehow he cared. "I want to know more about him," Luke finally said, breaking the silence. "About who he was." Emily smiled, a sad yet tender smile. "Then meet me tomorrow. I'll tell you everything you want to know." She wrote an address on a napkin and handed it to Luke before saying goodbye. As she left, Luke stood still, holding the napkin as if it were something precious. Mr. Johnson approached, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You were incredible today, Luke. I don't know if that's it, but I feel like I've started to understand something." The teacher nodded without saying anything else. He knew that this journey wouldn't be easy for Luke, but he also knew it was necessary. The cold wind cut through the streets of Columbus, Ohio, as Luke walked alongside Emily. It was the first time he had left the orphanage for something that didn't involve music or Ethan. Despite the anxiety growing in his chest, he forced himself to stay focused. With every step, he knew he was getting closer to answers he'd been searching for as long as he could remember. "Are you okay, Luke?" Emily asked, noticing the boy's silence. Luke looked at her and forced a smile. I think so. It's just strange. I don't even know what to expect. Emily nodded, adjusting her scarf around her neck. I understand, and I want you to know that whatever you find out today, you're not alone. Luke didn't reply, but those words were comforting. Emily had proven to be more than just a friend from his father's past. She seemed genuinely concerned about him and Ethan, as if she wanted to help them find something she herself might have lost. When they arrived at the small cafe where they were supposed to meet someone Emily described as a bridge to Michael, Luke couldn't contain his nervousness. The place was simple, with wooden tables and a welcoming aroma of fresh coffee. Who are we waiting for? Luke asked as Emily chose a table near the window. An old colleague of Michael's. They worked together in a studio back when he was composing. He might be able to tell us where to find your father. Luke felt his stomach churn. This was real. A few minutes later, a man walked in. He was short and stout, with graying hair and a worn wool coat. Emily stood up to greet him. Mark, thank you for coming. Mark nodded and gave Luke a curious look as he sat down. So, you must be Michael's son. Luke nodded, tense. Yes. Mark sighed, seeming to choose his words carefully. It's been years since I last saw your father. After he left the studio, he cut contact with almost everyone, but I heard he's living in Dayton now, working as a technician at a small theater. Dayton? Luke asked, his heart racing. Is that far from here? About 2 hours by car, Emily answered before looking back at Mark. Are you sure about that? Mark nodded. He used to come to Columbus once a year to buy equipment parts. That's how I heard where he was. Luke was silent, processing the information. He finally had a place, Dayton. The name of the city sounded like a riddle, but it was the most solid clue he'd ever had. Thank you, Mark, Emily said. Good luck, kid. Michael's not a bad person, just a man who got lost. Luke looked at Mark, but didn't respond. He felt a mix of hope and anger bubbling inside him, a combination he didn't know how to handle. The next day, Emily rented a car and drove Luke to Dayton. The ride was quiet, except for the low hum of the radio. Luke stared out the window, watching the open fields and small towns pass by. What are you going to say to him? Emily asked, breaking the silence. Luke took a while to answer. I don't know. I think I'll ask why. Why he left us. Why he never came back. Emily sighed, keeping her eyes on the road. Just be prepared to hear things that might not be easy to accept. Luke didn't reply, but her words echoed in his mind. When they arrived at the theater, the place looked simple, almost abandoned. The outer walls were worn from time, and the neon sign flickered with some letters missing. Is this it? Luke asked as he got out of the car. Emily nodded but said nothing. Luke took a deep breath and went inside. The theater was empty, except for a man on the stage, kneeling beside a lighting rig. He was thin with short gray hair, and his face bore the marks of a hard life. Luke knew it was him. Michael? Emily called softly. The man lifted his head, surprised, and then looked at Luke. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. You're? Michael started but couldn't finish the sentence. I'm Luke, your son, the boy said, his voice firm but filled with emotion. Michael stood up slowly, as if he were in a dream. He looked at Emily, then back at Luke, and finally lowered his head. I don't even know what to say. Luke felt anger rise in his chest. Maybe start by explaining why you left us. Why you left my mom alone with 2 young kids. Michael took a deep breath, seeming to wrestle with his own emotions. I thought I was doing the best. The best. Luke laughed without humor. Leaving us with nothing was the best. I was broken, Luke. Michael looked at him, his eyes filled with guilt. I was lost. Your mother was strong, much stronger than I was. I couldn't be what you needed, so you left. Just like that. Michael nodded, tears streaming down his face. Yes, It was the hardest decision of my life, and also the most cowardly. The silence that followed was heavy, full of unspoken words. Emily touched Luke's shoulder, trying to comfort him, but the boy stepped back. "Do you think just saying that makes everything okay?" Michael shook his head. "No, I know it doesn't. But I'm here now, and if you'll let me, I want to try and make it right." Luke felt tears welling up in his eyes, but he held them back. "I don't know if it can be fixed." Michael nodded, understanding. "Even so, I'll try." The morning was calm at Willow Creek Orphanage. The sun shone softly through the windows of the dining hall, while Ethan, now fully recovered, devoured a stack of pancakes. Luke, sitting across from his brother, barely touched his breakfast. His fingers drummed nervously on the table. "Are you okay?" Ethan asked, his smile sticky with syrup. "I think so," Luke replied, but the truth was that his stomach was in knots. Today was the day. Emily had arranged for Michael, the man Luke still hesitated to call his father, to come to the orphanage to meet his sons. The idea seemed simple to Ethan, but to Luke, it was like opening an old, painful wound. "Do you think he'll like us?" Ethan asked, his voice full of hope. Luke looked at his younger brother, feeling a lump in his throat. "Of course he will, Ethan. You're amazing." Ethan smiled, satisfied. But Luke returned to staring at the table, his mind full of doubts. When Michael arrived, he was received in the orphanage's small visiting room. The place was simple, with worn fabric sofas and a coffee table covered with old magazines. Emily stood beside him as promised, and Michael looked visibly nervous. "Are they coming?" he asked, adjusting the collar of his shirt as if it would make him look less awkward. "They are," Emily replied. "Breathe, Michael. They are your children." Michael laughed without humor. "They're my children, but I'm a stranger to them." Before Emily could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. Luke and Ethan entered the room, side by side. Ethan wore a hesitant smile, while Luke's face was serious, almost rigid. When Michael's eyes met theirs, he felt a wave of emotion that nearly knocked him over. There were his boys now grown. "Ethan, Luke," he murmured, his voice faltering. Ethan ran to Michael before any words could be spoken. He hugged him tightly, as if clinging to an idea he had always wanted to make real. "Dad," Ethan whispered. Michael froze for a moment, then hugged his son tightly, tears streaming down his face. "My boy," he said, his voice choked. "My boy." Luke remained where he was, watching the scene. He wanted to feel the same ease Ethan did, but everything inside him screamed. "You don't deserve this," Luke said, his voice cutting through the emotional moment. Ethan pulled away, looking at his brother confused. "Luke." Michael took a deep breath and looked at his eldest son. "I know I don't deserve it." "No, you don't know." Luke crossed his arms, the words coming out in a torrent. "You have no idea what we went through." Ethan opened his mouth to speak, but Michael raised a hand, asking for silence. "He's right, Ethan. I don't know." Michael stepped closer to Luke, but kept a respectful distance. "You have every right to be angry with me, Luke. I made a lot of mistakes." Luke stared at him, his eyes full of anger and hurt. "Mistakes? You call abandoning us a mistake? We went hungry, you know that? Mom got arrested because she was trying to take care of us." Michael closed his eyes, as if Luke's words were knives. I knew she was strong. I thought she could." "And you," Luke interrupted him. "You just gave up." "Yes, I gave up." Michael faced his son, the pain clear in his expression. "I have no excuses, Luke. I was broken, and I was a coward." Luke was silent, but his face showed that there was still a storm inside him. Ethan, who had been watching the tense exchange, tugged at Luke's sleeve. "He's here now, Luke. Why can't you give him a chance?" Luke looked at his brother, his anger mixed with confusion. "Because he wasn't here when it mattered, Ethan. But he's here now." Ethan insisted, his voice rising. The room fell silent, and Michael finally stepped closer to Luke. I know I can't change the past, Luke, and I don't expect you to forgive me now. Maybe not ever. But I'm here because I want to try. Luke stared at him for a long moment, his breathing heavy. Finally, he took a step back, as if needing space to think. It's not that simple, he said, his voice low. I know, Michael replied sincerely. Ethan, seeing that the moment was too tense, took Michael's hand and held it. Do you want to play ball with us? Michael looked at his younger son, surprised by the simplicity of the invitation. Of course, Ethan. I'd love to. And so, the three of them went to the open field behind the orphanage. Luke joined reluctantly, but Ethan's lightness seemed contagious. As they played, there were moments when Ethan's laughter filled the heavy silence, creating small fragments of something that could, perhaps, become a real bond. When the day ended, Michael was exhausted but grateful. Thank you for letting me be here today, he said, looking at his sons. Luke didn't respond, but he didn't pull away like before. Ethan smiled and gave his father one last hug. Come back soon, okay? Michael nodded, looking at Luke as if asking for permission. I'll come back if you want me to. Luke sighed but finally responded. We'll see. Michael smiled, knowing that though small, it was a beginning. The sound of children playing in the Willow Creek orphanage yard echoed in the air. Michael was sitting on a wooden bench, watching Ethan kick a ball against a wall, laughing every time it bounced back to him. Luke, however, was distant, sitting in a corner with his guitar in his lap, strumming absent-mindedly. Has he always been like this? Michael asked Emily, who was sitting beside him. Since you left, Emily replied, not softening her words. He grew up way too fast. Michael sighed, his gaze fixed on his eldest son. How do I reach him? Emily shrugged. You can't force it, Michael. It's going to take time. Maybe a lot of time. Michael nodded, but the weight on his shoulders seemed to double. Michael's efforts to reconnect were constant. He started visiting the orphanage regularly, bringing small gifts for Ethan, like a new soccer ball or books he thought the boy might like. For Luke, however, he never seemed to get it right. I brought this for you, Michael said one afternoon, handing Luke a brand new guitar case. Luke looked at the gift and then at Michael, his eyes narrowing. I don't need that. My guitar's fine as it is. Michael took a deep breath, trying not to let the rejection show. I just thought it might help. If you really want to help, stop showing up like you can make up for years of being gone with gifts, Luke replied, his voice cold as ice. Ethan, who was playing in the yard, stopped and looked at them. Luke! He began, but Luke abruptly stood up, putting the guitar under his arm. I don't need it, Luke repeated before walking away. Michael stood there, holding the guitar case as if it were an unbearable weight. He'll change his mind, Ethan said, trying to cheer up his dad. Michael forced a smile. I hope so. Days turned into weeks, and Michael's presence became a constant at the orphanage. He helped fix things there. Broken chairs, leaky faucets, even the fence around the yard. The idea of doing something useful helped him cope with the emptiness he felt from still not having gained Luke's trust. Ethan, on the other hand, seemed to absorb every moment with his dad. They played soccer together, laughed at silly jokes, and even worked on small projects, like a model airplane Ethan wanted to build. You're really staying, aren't you? Ethan asked one day, while painting the model blue. Michael looked at his younger son and nodded. I'm here to stay, Ethan. Ethan smiled, satisfied. One day, Luke will believe you. Michael sighed. I hope so. One night, while Luke was practicing guitar in his room, Michael knocked softly on the door. Can I come in? He asked. Luke didn't look at him but shrugged. You're already here, so... Michael entered, sitting on the bed opposite Luke's. I heard you playing the other day. You're good. Luke continued tuning the guitar, not responding. When I was younger, I used to play to clear my head. Music was always my way to escape. Luke finally looked at him, his eyes filled with anger. So that's what you did? Escaped? Michael swallowed hard, realizing the mistake in his words. That's not what I meant. But it's what you did. You left us because it was easier to run away than to stay and fight. Luke, I know I failed. No matter how much I try, I'll never be able to erase that. Then why are you here? Luke stood up, his voice full of frustration. To ease your guilt, to try to be a hero now, after years of being gone. Michael was silent for a moment, letting Luke's words echo through the room. I'm here because I want to be your dad again. Because I want to try, even if you never forgive me. Luke stared at him, his expression hardened. It's not that simple. Michael nodded. I know, but I'm going to keep trying, Luke. Without saying anything else, Michael left the room, leaving Luke alone with his thoughts. Over time, small changes began to happen. Luke was no longer so harsh in his words, and occasionally, Michael would catch him watching from afar while he played with Ethan. One afternoon, while Michael was fixing a chair in the yard, Luke approached. Are you almost done with that? Luke asked, his voice less tense than usual. Almost. Why? Luke shrugged. Because Mrs. Holloway said that chair's been broken since before I got here. Michael laughed. Well, I guess it's about time someone fixed it. Luke didn't respond but stayed nearby, watching as Michael worked. Are you really going to keep coming here? Luke finally asked. Michael paused and looked at him. I am, Luke. The boy stared at him for a moment before nodding slightly and walking away. It was small, but for Michael, it was a huge step. The following months brought more moments like that. Michael kept visiting, helping, and most importantly, staying present. Luke's anger didn't disappear completely, but it began to make room for something he didn't expect. Curiosity. He started listening when Michael talked about the past, his struggles, his regrets. And although the path to forgiveness was still long, they both began, little by little, to build something new. Autumn leaves covered the lawn around Willow Creek Orphanage, painting the scene in shades of orange and gold. It was a calm day, but for Luke, everything felt turbulent. He was sitting on one of the swings in the small playground, his guitar in his lap, but his hands weren't strumming the strings. His mind was too busy with the conversation he knew he needed to have. In the distance, he saw Ethan running across the yard, his face lit with a kind of joy he rarely had before Michael arrived. Their dad was there, helping the boy launch a kite into the air. Ethan's laughter filled the air, but Luke couldn't join in. Something inside him held him back, like a weight he couldn't let go of. Emily appeared in the playground, bringing 2 cups of hot chocolate. She sat on the swing next to Luke and handed him one of the cups. Do you want to talk? She asked, with the tone of someone who knew the answer was yes. Luke sighed, looking at the steaming liquid in the cup. I don't know what to do, Emily. She waited, giving him time to gather his thoughts. He wants us to go live with him, Luke finally said. Emily nodded, as if she had expected it. And how do you feel about that? Luke was silent for a moment before answering. I don't know. On one hand, it's what I've always wanted, you know? A family. But on the other hand, the orphanage is all we know. Here, I know Ethan is safe. I know he's stable. Emily leaned forward, looking at Luke with a gentle expression. And you? Are you safe here? Luke laughed softly but without humor. I don't know if that matters. My priority is Ethan. It always has been. Emily sighed but didn't push him. Later that afternoon, Michael called the 2 boys for a walk to the nearby lake. Ethan, as usual, was excited, running ahead while Luke and Michael walked in silence. He seems happy, Michael commented, breaking the silence. Luke looked at his younger brother, who was trying to jump from one rock to another without falling. He is... Michael put his hands in his pockets, hesitating before speaking again. I've been thinking, maybe you could come live with me. I have a small apartment in Dayton. It's not big, but it's cozy. Luke stopped walking, forcing Michael to do the same. That's what I wanted to talk to you about, Luke began, his voice firm but full of emotion. Michael turned to him, waiting. "I've thought a lot about it, and I don't think we're ready to leave here." Michael's expression shifted to something between surprise and pain. "You're not ready?" Luke nodded, trying to explain. "Look, I know you want us to be a family again, and I appreciate that. But the orphanage is where we feel stable. Here, I know Ethan has food, a roof over his head, and people who care about him." Michael was silent, processing his son's words. "You think I couldn't take care of you?" "It's not that, Dad," Luke replied, struggling to use the word. I don't want to risk it. Ethan's been through so much. He's finally happy here, and I don't want to take that away from him." Michael looked away, his jaw tight as he fought to control his emotions. "I understand," he finally said, his voice low. "I wish it were different, but I understand." Luke felt a pang in his heart at seeing the sadness in his father's eyes, but he knew he was making the right decision. "It doesn't mean we don't want you around. Ethan needs you. I do too. But here is where we feel safe right now." Michael nodded slowly, the weight of Luke's decision clearly on his shoulders. "If that's what you need, I'll respect it." Ethan came running back, interrupting the conversation. "Dad, did you see that? I jumped 3 rocks without falling." Michael smiled, forcing joy into his voice. "I saw, champ. You're amazing." Ethan laughed and kept running, oblivious of the seriousness of the conversation. That night, Michael called Luke for one last talk before leaving. They sat on the small couch in the visiting room, the space lit only by a dim lamp. "I'll keep coming, Luke, every week, if you'll let me." Luke looked at him, surprised. "You do that?" "Of course." Michael smiled, but there was a hint of sadness in his eyes. "I lost a lot of time with you. I'm not losing any more." Luke was silent for a moment before speaking. "Thank you." Michael put a hand on Luke's shoulder, squeezing gently. "I know it'll take time, but I hope that one day we can be a family, the way you need us to be." Luke nodded, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. When Michael left that night, Luke watched the car disappear down the orphanage's road. Ethan stood by his side, holding his hand. "He's coming back, right?" Ethan asked, his voice filled with worry. "He will, Ethan," he promised, Luke replied, squeezing his brother's hand tightly. And for the first time, Luke believed the promise. Mornings at Willow Creek Orphanage had never been so full of anticipation. For Ethan, the sound of a car approaching on the dirt road was a reason to run to the window. For Luke, it was a mix of anxiety and curiosity. Since the decision to stay at the orphanage, Michael had kept his promise to visit them weekly, a commitment that, over time, began to build a solid foundation between father and sons. It was Saturday, and Michael would be arriving at any moment. Luke was tuning his guitar in the yard, while Ethan ran around with his usual energy. "Luke, do you think he'll bring the tools to finish our treehouse?" Ethan asked, his eyes shining. "Probably. He said he'd stop by the store before coming." Ethan gave a small jump of joy before running off again, leaving Luke alone with his thoughts. Although the relationship with his father was still a work in progress, he couldn't deny that something was changing. The anger that once consumed him had subsided, making way for genuine curiosity about who Michael really was. When Michael arrived, he had 2 heavy boxes in the trunk. Ethan ran up to him, helping to carry the tools and excitedly shouting about building the treehouse. "Take it easy, champ. The tools are heavier than you think," Michael said, laughing as he adjusted the box in his son's arms. Luke watched from a distance, still wary, but began to approach. "So, did you bring everything?" Luke asked, trying to hide his interest. "Everything we need, and then some. We're finishing it today, I guarantee." They spent the rest of the day together, working on the small treehouse Ethan had been dreaming of for months. Michael, with patience and skill, taught the boys how to use tools while the 3 of them laughed at silly mistakes and celebrated small accomplishments. "Have you always been good at this?" Luke asked as he watched Michael saw a board. Michael stopped, looked at his son, and smiled. Not always. But when you have young kids, you learn to do everything. Luke didn't respond but kept watching, as if trying to decipher every word his father said. In time, Saturdays became a ritual. Michael showed up with ideas for projects, games, or even just to spend time with the boys. Ethan, with his open and optimistic nature, fully embraced his dad. For Luke, each day was an internal battle. But he began to notice that Michael's consistency was something he had never expected to see. "You're really trying, aren't you?" Luke said one afternoon as the two of them played an improvised game of chess. Michael looked at him, surprised, but with a calm smile. "I am, Luke, because you two are what matters." Luke nodded without saying anything more, but something inside him felt a little lighter. One day, while Luke was playing at a small restaurant in town, something unexpected happened. Among the customers who were listening attentively, an elegantly dressed woman approached after the performance. "You're Luke, right?" she asked, holding a business card between her slender fingers. "Yes, that's me. I'm Catherine Woods. I work with music projects and am a patron of a music school in Columbus. I heard you play a few weeks ago, and I remembered your performance. You have talent." Luke blinked, surprised by the direct compliment. "Thank you, Ms. Woods." She smiled. "I'd like to help. I spoke with Mr. Johnson, and he told me you've been practicing with a very old guitar. I'd like to donate some instruments to the community project, but I also want to offer something more personal." "Personal?" Luke asked, confused. "Yes, a scholarship for you to study music at a renowned school. Your skills deserve to be developed." Luke's heart raced. "A scholarship? To study?" "Exactly. I'll take care of everything," she said. "Your talent shouldn't be limited by a lack of resources." Luke could barely respond, but the smile on Mr. Johnson's face, who was beside him, said it all. When he told Michael and Ethan the news, they reacted in completely different ways. "That's amazing, Luke. You're going to be famous," Ethan shouted, jumping around his brother. "It's a great opportunity, son," Michael said, proud but also with slight concern. "I don't know." Luke began, his hesitation evident. Michael placed a hand on his shoulder. "I know change is scary, but this is something you deserve. I'll be here, no matter what you decide." The following months were a mix of goodbyes and new beginnings. Luke prepared to enroll in music school with the constant support of Mr. Johnson and Mrs. Holloway. Michael continued visiting them at the orphanage, keeping his promise to be present. On the night before Luke left for Columbus, Michael called the two boys for one last talk. "I know this change is going to be big, Luke, but I want you to know that I'm here for you and for Ethan, always." Luke looked at his dad, and for the first time, felt that those words were true. "Thank you, Dad." Michael smiled, moved to hear Luke call him that. On the day of departure, Ethan held Luke's hand tightly while Ms. Wood's car waited at the orphanage entrance. "You're coming back, right?" Ethan asked, tears in his eyes. "Always," Luke replied, hugging his brother. Michael squeezed Luke's shoulder. "We're proud of you." Luke nodded, holding back tears as he got into the car. As the vehicle pulled away, he looked out the window, seeing Michael and Ethan waving side by side. For the first time, Luke felt like he was leaving behind something that wasn't just a place. It was a family, and so began a new chapter, not just for Luke, but for all of them. A future of hope, built on the mistakes of the past and the promise of a better tomorrow.